Welcome to Let's Go Further, a podcast that shines a light on the role of further education in transforming people's lives. In this first series, we are talking with learners, teachers, business people and professors about why further education matters to them. I'm your host, Joe McLaughlin, Foundation Manager at the Skills and Education Group, an organisation that champions the further education and skills sector. In this episode, our guest is Professor Lee Elliott-Major from the University of Exeter. Lee is the UK's first ever Professor of Social Mobility, and his work is dedicated to improving the prospects of disadvantaged young people. He has written several books and regularly appears in national broadcast and print media. So, to quote the title of one of Lee's books, what should we do about social mobility? Lee, good afternoon. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon.
I suppose I'd like to begin with just a bit of a broad question, really, and ask you what your education was like.
This topic is as much as a sort of personal passion as a professional interest. And, I come from, I guess you'd classify it as a working class background, I suppose, West London. For various reasons, I ended up living on my own at age 15 and effectively dropped out of school. So I had to go back and retake my A-levels at college, Richmond College, which was tertiary college. I've ended up becoming an educationalist, but it's quite unusual, and it's very unusual actually to be a university professor and to have someone who's had my sort of background. So if you look at me at age 16, if I was one of those statistics that we talk about in these national debates, you just said, oh, this guy doesn't have much of a chance in life. But I did really, through friends, extended family, teachers, people helped me. And I always think we sort of forget this, actually. A lot of what social mobility is about is people helping other people. We might get back into that later. But it's really through the help of others that I returned to college. And then I went to Sheffield University. I actually read physics there. I stayed on to do a PhD. I then became the eternal student because then I did a master's at Imperial College. And then I went into journalism. I was on The Guardian for many years. And then at the Sutton Trust charity, where I became chief exec eventually, and then professor for the last sort of 4 years. So I've had a very unusual career in many ways, but the common, I suppose, theme throughout is a sort of commitment to social justice / social mobility, i.e. that your background shouldn't determine what you do in life, irrespective of what that is in life. Whether you become a teacher, a social worker, or a politician, my view is that should be down to your interest, your hard work, probably a bit of luck, but certainly not who you come from and where you live. And sadly, in the UK, that's too much the case, and even more the case now, probably, than when I grew up. The chances that I had as a young person, I'm very conscious that I suspect if I'd been growing up today, I maybe wouldn't have got to where I got to.
I was just thinking about the kind of what you were saying about social mobility and about it needs to be about talent and ability and interest, right? Whereas a lot of the narrative around it seems to be very clear and clean around this is where you start and this is where you end up. And if that is a financially stronger position or a socially stronger position, that's viewed as socially mobile, even if you yourself don't necessarily kind of like what you're doing or appreciate what you're doing. I know that in other interviews and other podcasts, you've sort of unpacked the idea of mobility as we need to broaden our understanding of it as a stable job that you're passionate about, something that kind of gets you out of bed in the morning and you're very, very happy to do, rather than it just being about earning more money or having a bigger house or however it is you define it. So I just wondered if you could talk a bit more about that in detail.
So I think that we as a country have bought into a very individualistic notion of success and a very academic one as well. I think we've been influenced a lot by American culture, and modern capitalism is sort of predicated on this thing called the American dream, right? So, and in some ways that's a very great concept, the idea that you can make it anywhere from anywhere. The problem is, I think, with the American dream, it's become sort of bastardized over the years into a very individualistic notion, that I'm going to, on my own, make lots of money, become famous. You see it in all the sort of modern TV programs. You get the winner that wins it all, and everyone else is a kind of loser in these sort of talent shows. I think that encapsulates the culture in which we exist. And I think there's a real pushback on this. When I give talks about social mobility, across the country, most people say to me, Lee, I don't particularly want lots of money. I want a decent house. I want a life where I can see my friends, be with my family, lead a decent life, and also, by the way, give back to others. I certainly are getting that more and more, particularly from younger generations. I think there's a real backlash against what we see as success, right? So now other countries that I've visited and given talks at, including, and these are some of the usual suspects like the Scandinavian countries, but also places like Canada and Australia, I do think that there is a more sort of notion of collective success, that people are seen as successful if they somehow given back to society. And I just think we've got the balance wrong. And there's many people doing great things for society in this country, but I don't think we reward them as much. So whenever you get into these debates about social mobility, inevitably you get into debates about inequality as well. And I always say it's two sides of the same coin for me. Your chances of climbing the social ladder are always going to be higher if the rungs of a ladder are nearer together, right? If inequality is less. But also it's about choice. It's about whether you want to climb up that ladder. In one article in the Daily Mail, the headline was "From bin man to professor," because I once was a bin man in between my student terms. I always say that to students is, look, I was very proud to be a bin man. That was a service, right? That was a public service. And so you've got to be just really careful, I think, how you judge success. But, certainly in education, I think we also have this sort of implicit hierarchy, and that is, the more academic you are, the more status you get. When you meet so many people that are talented in different ways, right? Whether they call it vocational, creative. This country, I think we're very good creatively, vocationally, but the school system, in my view, doesn't support that talent. And I don't think we give it enough credit in public debates either.
Great. Yeah. And certainly that kind of thing about having a wider acceptance of skills or kind of different types of knowledge is definitely something that resonates with us. I mean, certainly over 50% of our applicants to our grants program this year have been on vocational courses and are genuinely passionate, genuinely committed, genuinely interested in working in their local community on those things. And they just, for whatever reason, they just didn't find a home at school, or do you know what I mean? It just didn't fit for them or work for them in the same way.
I mean, I'm very passionate about schooling now, and I give lectures to teachers about disadvantage and how you can help poorer children in particular. But I struggled at school. I effectively dropped out of school for all sorts of reasons. There's a lot happening in my back at home. For many young people I try and support and give advice to. The reason I do that is because of my background. I understand what it was like if you don't have, for whatever reason, a mum and dad who are supporting you. And I happen to be very academic, so I could kind of get away with it, right? Because I could do that. Now, a lot of my friends just had different talents, but because they weren't able, like me, to sort of memorize things last minute, they struggled at school. So I really feel for young people, and I make a point of helping as many people who are doing, for example, BTECs and thinking about alternative routes as those young people I help to navigate the university system, because I think they're equally valid.
So sort of having said all that, then kind of what do you see the kind of role of FE and skills providers in sort of social mobility being? And do you have say, if you had one sort of blue sky policy to help, or one great idea that would help improve things for learners in FE and also staff in FE, kind of what would you recommend?
Before we come to that, I mean, one of the things I would say, I worry about our political leaders is that because so few come from different backgrounds, that there often isn't as much understanding or empathy for the diverse routes which young people follow. So most of our leaders come from a very narrow range of academic backgrounds, right? If you had more diversity at top, you then get better policy making in these areas. But anyway, that's just another point. What would I do? An obvious one for me, I was one of the champions of the pupil premium when it first came on board over 10 years ago now. I mean, I think it's a national scandal in many ways that we've got extra funding in terms of schools, up to age 16, right? But once you get into further education colleges, there isn't the equivalent amount of money. Now, I would probably double the pupil premium in schools, to be honest with you, given my research and others showing the extent of needs out there now, particularly in the cost of living crisis, particularly post-pandemic. But, if anyone's serious about social mobility, if any minister is serious about so, you would be funding FE at higher levels, and you would be doing that, in my view, targeting the disadvantaged learners in particular. So I would have a pupil premium in FE, and it would be at realistic level, so you can help young people. On top of that, you would need some sort of guidance about how you use that best, and I do loads of work with teachers about, what are the best bets for using that money. I think we probably could do more of that in FE, to be honest with you. A lot of my lectures tend to be with teachers that are going to go into the school sector. A lot of the principles that I talk about probably just as much apply to FE. I think the only other priority for me would be early years. I would probably have a return to something like the sort of Sure Start centres that we had, 25 years ago. But those two would be top of my priority list.
And are there any older sort of funding policies that you'd bring back? So I mean, I remember when I was doing my A levels, EMA was a big thing for kind of keeping post 16s in education. Is there kind of things there that you'd look to bring back? Or
I think that's a really good question. I was involved in some of the discussions about the use of the educational maintenance allowance. It was reviewed again. This was probably over a decade now, and the feeling was that it wasn't as impactful as it could have been, and as you know, it got scrapped. My sense now, and I haven't got evidence behind this, to be honest with you, but my sense is because of the cost of living crisis, because people are really up against it now, I wonder whether we need to think about having to reintroduce that help. I get reports now from colleges and schools of young people unable to get the bus to afford the bus to college. I gave a talk at Exeter College recently. I did a lecture for A-level students there. And it was interesting talking to the staff there at the college. It's a very big college, just about the difficulties their pupils are finding in getting to the college. So, maybe we need to consider a reintroduction of that. I think we probably need to do some analysis on that. But certainly something to look at.
Yeah, certainly. So for us, we had applications from 344 learners. The biggest request amongst them all was travel, whether that was paying for bus fare or whether it was driving lessons or road tax or MOTs. It seemed to be that the thing people most needed money for wasn't the actual education itself, wasn't the course content or the tuition fees or the books or anything like that. It was the stuff around education that enables education to happen, if that makes sense.
One of the things I wanted to do was look into travel. Does where you live determine how easy it is to pay for travel to get to college, right? Because we found in the Southwest, we did a review of social mobility obstacles specifically in the Southwest, and because it's a big rural coastal region, there's real issues around travel, right? But what we found was that it's almost a lottery, that the local authority you happen to live under, some of them provide, some funding, some of them don't. And I talked to the government about it, and they said it's the responsibility of the local authorities. But as far as I understand it, I need to do some more research on this. It seems to be a bit of a lottery at the moment, right? Which can't be fair. I think we should have an entitlement up to age 18. It was at age 16 that it changed. I think up to age 16, basically there is, you get it for free mainly. After 16, it's suddenly that assumption seemed to go, we should help young people up to age 18. Having two children age 17 and 19 myself, I can tell you, they haven't grown up properly yet at that age. I mean, they're still in many ways young children. And yet we have this kind of convenient government thing which says, oh, they're all adults at sort of 18. Actually, we're not going to even help them after age 16. I think that really is a big impediment actually to life chances, and it's something we should look at. I would probably extend to 19, to be honest with you. I mean, a lot of young students that I meet, honestly, they're still growing up, right? It takes, I think some people estimate, is it that age 25 by the time your brain stops developing? I think we certainly should look at travel across the country.
I just wanted to circle back to the metaphor of the ladder, which you've used and lots of people have used kind of when talking about mobility. And it's the two things, right? It's you've got to help people climb it, so you've got to help the climber and put the climber in the best position they can, but you can also, if possible, make the rungs of the ladder closer together, because the fear is, if you just let the climber shoot up and support the climber to shoot up and get away from where they came from, it leaves the places where they came from in just the same situation. So that person's been well served, but the wider community is left struggling. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on how we can support kind of wider communities while supporting individuals.
Yeah, I mean, I have used the metaphor of the ladder a lot. I mean, I do and ah about that, to be honest with you, because it kind of by implication sort of says, oh, those at the top are better than those at the bottom, right? I mean, when sociologists first came up with the social class categorizations, it wasn't actually meant to be hierarchical, believe it or not. It was just really describing people from different backgrounds, and I think because society has become so unequal financially that you've got these huge gaps now. But a lot of people can move down the ladder and have great lives. I've got lots of friends who had mum, dads in busy jobs who've said, no, I don't want that hectic life. I know I'm going off a tangent here, but I would classify myself as an awkward climber. I'm someone who comes from a background and essentially lost their connections with that background. My brother famously sort of said, "Oh, Lee, you sound like Tony Blair," and that from where I came from, where people have got quite a sort of London accent, that was you've become posh. You're the blue-eyed boy sort of thing. On one level, it was meant with a fondness, but on another level, it's sort of it's like you're no longer part of us. And if I'm honest with you, I mean, my mum, she's passed away now, bless her, but I think she never quite understood what I did, because in her mind, I ended up in this very middle class world, right? Talking on the TV and on podcasts, and she was very proud of it, but also it was an alien world in many ways, right? So being socially mobile isn't necessarily a complete success story, right? What I found is, for me and for many others in the studies, you make sacrifices because you leave the community you're from, and then you kind of never quite feel at home in the community that you kind of ended up in. That metaphor of the ladder, maybe I shouldn't use it as much as I do. I don't know. Maybe it's more escalators or something else that's a bit more closer to reality.
So I just wanted to talk a little bit more about the importance of bringing up local communities alongside successful students, because a role of a lot of the colleges we work with, they describe themselves as hubs for business development, local government initiatives. They offer training to a wide range of learners that work locally, improve the economy, deliver services in the local area. And then they themselves also offer childcare, counselling services, discounted catering, hair and beauty or lifestyle service to learners. And I was just curious because compared to, say, my experience of university, where I had a good university experience, but I never felt particularly attached to the place. I had a good education, I had good friends, but I didn't feel particularly attached to the place. I was just wondering if you had any thoughts on the importance of bringing up local communities alongside successful students and how we might do that.
I think this is one of the areas where universities could learn from colleges, actually. I don't think universities do enough in terms of their civic roles. One of the programs I'm involved in piloting is using undergraduates as tutors in local Exeter schools. But what I was thinking, if that pilot works on a very local level, if we want to expand that to the region and indeed eventually the nation, the whole country, you'd have to engage with big colleges, local colleges. That's the only way you're going to get to young people in those places. But in general, education can act as a sort of anchor institution for communities. So I'm a real big supporter of this. The only thing I would challenge colleges and some schools, we're doing some pilots with schools acting as community hubs at the moment as well, is just make sure that you are learning from the evidence of what works. What are the best bets given the sort of global evidence? I think the locality is always unique. You always got a unique mix of things there. But my challenge to people is, have you looked at the evidence of what works, you know? But certainly my view is that education is more than just teaching. You know, now some people challenge that. I think you've got to give the resource to back it up. But I think in the reality of the world we're in, with the profound social and economic inequalities that we're experiencing, I think education is going to have to play a role. So I love the idea of colleges being sort of community hubs.
Yeah, absolutely. So going back to that idea of, I think, as you said previously, kind of community colleges on the American model.
Listen, it's probably never going to happen, is it? But I honestly think we should rebrand FE colleges as community colleges, because I think that encapsulates them more. And sadly, the FE moniker is just associated for me with underfunding, with FE being the sort of Cinderella sector, you know, that's not given enough attention. Couldn't we just rebrand, if I can use that term, and call them community colleges? Because I think that's a much better description in many ways.
As we kind of round out the chat now, I just wanted to ask you if there's a couple of things we should be wary of. So I know you've spoken in length in your book about the enemies of social mobility, but in this context, so one, what would be an enemy of social mobility? And then particularly in this context, how do you think that antagonistic relationship plays out?
You know, when we came up with that title, Enemies, we really, so this is from our book, Social Mobility and Its Enemies, available still in all good bookstores, published by Penguin. And, you know, it was a broad idea of enemies. So it's everything from, you know, inequality, for example, I think we talk about in the book, to the vested interests of particular politicians. And you know, I do worry. You know, I'm really pleased that the new Social Mobility Commission has sort of said it's going to prioritise some of these areas over the more sort of, you know, academic side of things. You know, we should be spending as much time on this area as the university access debates that we have in the press and in public. You know, we should be spending as much time thinking about apprenticeships, skills. And you know, my worry is that particularly when we have a political system that seems so short-term and so sort of, you know, so much upheaval, that you don't get the sort of long-term strategies that we need actually to address some of these really fundamental issues. And I say that because I think, you know, we were talking earlier about culture and valuing what we value in society. I think that's a long-term challenge. You know, I think that's a 5-10 year at least program, you know. And by the way, I would probably, call it community colleges. I would then think about serious advocacy over a number of years about the funding that they receive. Coming back to what I do with schools, I'd love to work more with colleges about in terms of just the teaching as well. You know, I do best bets for the classroom or for disadvantaged learners. We should be doing more on that.
So the reason I picked on the enemies is I think it's an evocative word, and it's certainly one that resonated with me. There's a bit in it, and I know you've spoken before about tutoring, and tutoring as a kind of the preserve of the middle classes who want to help their kids get on. And I realise I'm guilty of it myself, because I tutor, so in order to earn money to help put some money aside for my daughter, and then obviously I'm complicit in this structure. So I was just curious as to how you see that playing out in the sort of schools and FE sector, whether that was about, you know, do colleges need to get braver at talking to schools about what they offer? Do schools need to get braver at directing their learners towards colleges?
Quickly on that, I mean, you know, I've become more and more convinced by the power of vested interests in the country not to change much, in terms of the schooling system generally, in terms of, it's a very academic system. I think we fail a quarter of children every year. In GCSEs week, we will have 25% of young people labelled failures because they didn't get grade 4 in English and maths. My view is that there's a lot of talented young people in that group who haven't done well at school and will end up probably going to an FE college to do retakes or to think about other options. I just think we fail those children. I think it's the school system failing that. I don't think it's teachers. I think it's the way that we created the school system. I also think we give too much attention to the universities in terms of public debate. But, there's a bit of me that feels that there is this incredibly vested interest to keep things the way they are. Because, people want to retain their position in society. A lot of the research we do keeps coming back to this incredibly powerful force, and it's the force of parents wanting to do the best for their children. And I think you just never underestimate that. Never underestimate it.
How far would you take that, Liam? I mean, would you penalise schools if students left with no grades, or do you think if colleges had to pick up, they should receive funding in proportion to the amount of extra? Do you know what I mean? The amount of gap there is, or how would it? I'm just curious to how you might see it working.
Well, I would look at the curriculum in schools at a much earlier age. I personally would look at having more vocational options earlier on in the curriculum. Now, some people sort of critique that, saying, because will this be a curriculum for the poor kids and so you have to be really careful how you do it. But at the moment, you talk to teachers and they'll know at age 11, probably even earlier, which children aren't going to get the grades at age 16. And it's incredibly demoralizing, dispiriting for those young people. So it'd be more fundamental for me. I don't think it's about penalizing or tweaking the system. Certainly the retakes, because a lot of young people have to do retakes at GCSEs. There, I think, again, the record isn't great. There's a lot of them that just fail again. So I do wonder whether we need a different approach to that, I have to say. But probably not funded that well, I suspect, that retakes provision.
And then I just wanted to end on a more sort of personal question. You're the country's first social mobility professor, or is it even the world's?
Yeah, we don't know of one of it yet. But I think there are a few, because I had a few inquiries and a few people in other universities saying, we're thinking of this. So I think there might be a few more now, but certainly we think I am the first. Yeah.
So as that sort of trendsetter, what are your kind of ambitions for the role? Like, what would you? Because I know you've spoken about some of the initiatives you're looking at trialing in the Southwest, but what are your kind of bigger picture aims for the next sort of 5-10 years?
I'm a professor of practice, right? So I'm quite different to many professors. What does that mean? That means my measures of success are very much, real change within the system, but for people, right? So it's an amazing role, and I'm really pleased that it's been a success. But I just want to be able to, in 10 years' time, to look back and say, how many children, Lee, did you actually help, right? Because you can talk about this stuff a lot and you can do lots of research on it. I think the hardest thing of all is actually making change happen. And I suppose some of my work is trying to get governments to change things. So, for example, we're changing the way that personal statements are done for university applications at the moment. So I'm very proud to have been part of that change, so they can't be gamed by the middle classes. But then as I said earlier, I also try and help young people out personally as well. So I've got a number of students of different ages who I've tried to help advise, and so you're giving back in a very direct way like that. So come back and ask me in 10 years' time, right? But I hope I can report back and that I've made a difference.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Let's Go Further, which was produced by the Skills and Education Group. Don't forget to subscribe to receive future episodes, and you can let us know what you think about what you hear on Twitter and LinkedIn. So, join us next time for more honest, insightful and inspiring conversations from Let's Go Further.